Trashmaxx to Supermaxx, Part 2. The saga continues. If you haven't seen Part 1, you need to check it out, and you can see the issues that I had when I first got this truck. And I'm not talking about just like personal preference issues. There were some serious issues with this truck. If you've got a mystery click that you can isolate and your differentials look good both front and rear, you really need to check out that video. Anyways, moving on to the next chapter in the life of the Trashmaxx, I give you the Supermaxx, I hope. First things first is the Hobbywing Max 6 ESC. The original stock ESC took a crap, so that was my first upgrade out of necessity. I have not replaced the stock servo yet. It actually seems to be holding up. I have plans to replace it as soon as it dies. Regardless of what servo I put in it, I wanted to add a little bit more support in the bell crank there, and the aluminum is what I went with because the plastic one was worn out. I didn't want to go through the same thing. When it starts to get soggy and sloppy, it just makes it harder to steer and works that servo harder. I did have to replace the rear shock towers there. A lot of the stock parts I'm not even going to list. I'm just going to say what I replaced. The main thing back here, I got a brand new rear bulkhead. I never liked the way the cush drive sits. It's not anchored towards the front. If you ever had one apart, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The shaft where the spur gear sits is not anchored at all into the bulkhead. Why? I don't know. Since the only thing securing that cush drive shaft in place is the clamping force of that cover onto the two bearings, I went with aluminum. My second upgrade, the fan in the back, the original one was wore out and just busted up. Everything that was original up here had the consistency of a wet noodle, and I've never been a fan of plastic bearing carriers, so I went with an aluminum caster and steering block. You'll notice that I have the stock suspension arm with an RPM up on the top. The RPM arms actually broke the first day that I took it out, and I went back to the stock ones. The stock ones seem to be holding up better. I stuck with the RPM on the top, and we'll see how long that lasts. I was able to use an RPM threaded hinge pin for the bottom suspension arm, but not on the top, unfortunately. I did finally get my drive cups here. I've read and heard a lot of really good things about the GPMs. I'm hoping that they actually hold up better than the stock ones did. So far, my favorite upgrade yet has been these springs, and I'll get into the tuning details later. As you all know, the Xmaxx is notorious for having issues with the differentials both front and rear, and I wanted to strengthen up that gearbox as much as possible by putting an aluminum hinge pin plate underneath the skid plate and a aluminum cover, and I think it's working out so far. The front shock towers were replaced, as well as the front bumper, the front skid plate, and the bumper mounts, and I also installed this T-Bone Racing bumper. It offers a ton of protection. I love this thing. Moving on to the rear of the truck, it's pretty much the same deal as the front of the truck. There's an aluminum rear hub carrier, an RPM top suspension arms, and stock lower suspension arms, both held in at the top and the bottom by a RPM threaded hinge pin. Got the same GPM drive cups, and my favorite, the dual rate Proline springs. Just like the front, the rear also got an aluminum diff cover and an aluminum hinge pin plate. I think those are going to help a lot with the gearbox, giving it a bit of strength. I did replace the rear bumper mount with a RPM mount. The top mount is a stock one, as well as the bumper itself. I wanted to eliminate the wheelie bar. It just gets in the way, and it was completely useless. To be honest, this RPM low profile wheelie bar is pretty much useless as well. I'm gonna have to put some bigger wheels on it to get it to function. Even with the bigger Arrma wheels on it, I still scrape the bumper before the wheels make contact with the ground. It's pretty much useless. Here's a better look at the cush drive plate and the hinge pin plate that I was talking about. The only things that haven't been replaced yet have been the shocks, the center chassis, the servo, the motor, and the axles. Pretty much everything else has been. Yeah, these wheels and tires have a higher initial cost, but I've blown through 3 stock ones, and I can't even get these to balloon, so I already know right there I'm going to save more money in the long run. Not to mention I get better grip, and when I'm flying through the air, the increased weight with the rotational mass keeps the truck straight. I don't have to worry about it twisting through the air. Some people have an issue with these wheels. I don't. I love them. You know, if you're running plastic hubs and plastic carriers, you're gonna have an issue with these wheels, so don't get me wrong. I can understand why people don't like them, but I have aluminum for a reason. I wish I could sit here and say that everything is sunshine and rainbows in the Trashmaxx world, but unfortunately that's just not the case. Even with upgrades, you're still going to have issues. Like I said earlier, the first time I took Trashmaxx out to dial in these dual rate springs, the 2 right lower RPM arms both broke in 2 different places. So being completely unimpressed, I just replaced them with stock. I'm not even going to send them back in. I mean, if they can't even last a day, they're not worth my time. At the moment, I'm still waiting for my Hot Racing 50-tooth spur gear from China. Until then, I'm just going to keep replacing these things with stock. Hopefully it gets here soon. I did figure out why I kept blowing up my rear diff. Apparently during the disassembly and reassemblies, I somehow forgot this bearing. It works a lot better with that bearing. And since I reinstalled it, I haven't had an issue with the rear diff since. Knock on wood. I could spend an entire another video just showing comparisons between where it is now and where it was, so I just kind of picked a few to highlight a few points. The general consensus seems to be that if you tighten up tolerances or use aluminum parts that you're just going to break more things. I disagree with that 100%. It all depends on what you're replacing and why. Because if you've got soft parts and they're sloppily assembled together, when you're going through the air, tumbling on the ground, you're going to break a hell of a lot more. Especially with the Xmaxx, it's big, it's fast, and it's heavy. And I wanted everything to be as tightly together as possible, closer to the chest. I mean, think about it. If you're flying through the air and you land on a hill, do you want to have your arms and legs flailing everywhere, or are you going to pull them closer to your chest? The first comparison is pretty simple. It's just simple steering. The Xmaxx flips over a lot less now on turns. Second comparison is pretty simple too. It's just suspension as you're driving along the ground. It's so much tighter now. It doesn't resemble a sack of bolts bouncing along a trampoline anymore. Before, I could have never have landed a jump like this. It would have either rolled over or broke something. So these next 2 comparisons are smaller jumps between its former self and current self. I think the differences between the 2 are pretty drastic. You know, these differences may seem kind of subtle and minuscule until you get into bigger air, harder landings, and faster speeds. And that's when they really get magnified and cause a lot of havoc. So you'll see on this jump, the heavier tires and everything being tightly together, the centrifugal force of those tires is actually able to keep this thing straight and bring it down, land it, and everything was okay. Versus before, as soon as I went to go bring it down to land it, it went crooked on me and just broke my steering block. I think this comparison kind of proves my point the best. You know, you got all this gyroscopic motion of these heavier wheels being anchored in with the aluminum, and you can see it stays straight the entire time. All the anchor points being aluminum, the only flex is in the arm, and that's pretty limited, so you don't get this flailing effect. You can literally see in this shot how the rotating tires are just pulling the Xmaxx in any direction that the anchor points or the arms want to flex. I could be crazy, but which one do you think is going to break more? You know, before I get into the future of what I want to do with the Trashmaxx, I almost forgot the springs. So it's simple. The hardest upper spring all around, front and rear, and in the front the lowers are the medium springs, and in the rear they are the hardest springs. And all 4 shocks are filled with Team Losi Racing 60 weight fluid. The hard part is adjusting your preload. It all depends on how you drive and what you're going to be doing. That's the tricky part. I typically drive it on the same terrains, so the spring rates are, you know, that can be tricky too, I guess, if you're switching terrain, you know, from bumpy to smooth. But I found that this combination seems to work best for me. You might find something different for you. I also really haven't had a chance to get out and try different fluids yet, different weights. I'm sure that'll make a big difference. I just haven't had time. So getting back to the future, I definitely want to replace the center chassis and put in some thicker shock shafts. The servo, I would love to replace the servo soon. I'm just waiting for the current one to die. So I don't have too many worn out stock replacements left, and I don't have too many more upgrades left that I want to do. If you've been paying attention to the chapter titles, you'll notice that chapter 7 is the next chapter, and I'd like to avoid that one, so I think I'm pretty much done with the Trashmaxx for now at least. Don't worry though, when I do finally get these last few things done, I will let you know, and I'll put out a video continuing the saga, so make sure you smash the bell, subscribe, and I will catch you later. See ya.